My name is Matt. Welcome to my shop and welcome to the assembly instructions for chair kit style number 5. Style 5 features a single compound curve back slat and an overall mission or arts and crafts style feel. That's going to be due to the thicker material for the legs, the front and rear legs, and also the lower rail down here. In front of me I have a maple, a red oak, and a white oak. The red oak and white oak have a oil-based polyurethane applied to them, and then the maple has a water-based polyurethane applied, which preserves the whitish look of the maple a lot better than an oil-based. So let's get into the assembly. It's a good idea to do a test assembly of your chair kit. That's going to help to familiarize yourself with all the parts, where they all go and how they go together, and also make sure that everything goes together properly. Now this chair kit won't actually go together right out of the box. It does need one small tweak, which we'll take care of in a little bit. But I thought first we just go through all the parts, kind of talk about where they all go and how they all connect. That way we're a little more familiarized with things. Then we can do our small tweak, and then we can do our test assembly. So the first thing you're going to get, the biggest thing, is going to be the seat. So you're going to have the seat, which is all scooped out ready for you, and you're going to have the corner blocks with the mounting hardware. Next up, you're going to have the pair of rear legs. These are going to have their mortises down here for where the seat area is, where all the rails connect. You're also going to have a mortise down here for the lower rail, and you also have a mortise up here for the crest rail. And you'll have a right and left one of those. Now speaking of the rail area, the first little rail here is the lower rail. This has got a rabbit along the top here, which is going to receive that back edge of the seat. It's got two tenons on the ends, which will go into the rear legs, and it has a slot here, which will receive the back slat. The crest rail has tenons on the ends to go into the tops of those legs, and it's going to have a slot down here to receive the top of the back slat. And here is that back slat. That's a compound curved slat, so it's curved in this direction, as well as in this direction here, and it's going to go into those slots in the lower rail as well as the crest rail. Now jumping to the front of the chair, the first thing we have here are the front legs. Those are going to have the mortises on top for those top rails, as well as the mortises down here towards the bottom for the lower rails. Now the connecting rail, which goes between the two legs, is going to be this guy here with the two straight tenons. And those has a front and back, which is going to be indicated by the angle on the end. So the shoulders on here are actually angled a little bit. So you want the wider side or the pointier side facing the front, which is going to be this one here. So if I have a square here and I bring this in, you can see that it's just a little bit out of square. It has a little bit of an angle in this direction here. So you want to angle it back towards the back. Now besides the front and back orientation, this thing is symmetrical, so you could do this way or this way, depending on the look that you're going for. Now to connect the front and the back, you have the connecting assembly. So we have the connecting rails, the big ones, and the connecting rails, the small ones. These are going to have square shoulders on one end, and they're going to have an angled tenon on the other end. So both the wide ones and the narrow ones are going to have those angles there, and those are some pretty fun looking angles. Now for the bit of work that we need to do, we need to get the back slat to fit down into the lower rail. So out of the box, the lower rail is going to have this radius end to the slot, and the back slat is going to be all squared up. So as it goes right now, this back slat will not fit down into this slot because it's the same width as the extents of the slot here. So you have two options. If you really want to, you can square up the ends of the slot so you have a squared off look as that panel comes into that lower rail. Now one thing to consider is you're probably going to break this edge on here, and you're going to give it probably a little bit of a round over anyway. So rounding over the bottom here to actually match the curvature of the slot, I think is a much easier and more practical way to go. But if you want to square it up, you totally can do that. So to round off the ends of this thing, it's actually pretty easy. You can do this pretty quickly with either a sander and just give that a light radius, or you can use other tools like a rasp to do exactly the same thing. So basically those corners just tuck down into the slot, and it looks pretty good like that. So with that out of the way, now we can continue with the assembly. So that connection is all set to go. So we can drop in the crest rail on top of the back slat, and then bring in the rear legs. Now the tenons in the rails go into the mortises in the legs. So that takes care of the back assembly. Now we can add all of the connecting rails. So we have these guys, they have the angle tenons, they're gonna go in the back with the angle kind of facing outwards. So just like this. And then we can add the front assembly. So we have the front legs, and we'll put the connecting guy here in between them. Something like that. And we can drop this whole assembly on top of those connecting ones. And now we have a chair frame. We can also toss the seat on here, see how that's going to look. There we go. So our chair is test and dry assembled. So now we can work towards getting this thing all finished prepped. But before we do that, we have one small detail. We got to finish up the seat. So let's grab this guy and take care of this thing. So as we're thinking about the edge treatment on the seat, there are two areas we really want to think a little bit specifically about. So this back edge here, you probably don't want to do any sort of round over or serious edge treatment back here because this curve here butts up into that lower rail. So if you're bringing the lower rail like this, you can see that these butt up together nicely. So if you don't want basically a crumb catch down here, a little groove for things to get caught in, it's probably not the best idea to put any kind of edge profiling along the back. Now, one area you do want some edge profiling is going to be right up here at the front of the seat. You want to make sure this front edge is really soft and really broken because this is where someone's leg is going to be sitting. And if you have a sharp edge there pressing up against the back of someone's leg, it's not going to be super comfortable. So you want to make sure you at least put a pretty significant round over on the front edge. The radius of round over you put on that front edge is totally up to you. I'm going to go for a little more of a harsher type of feel. So this is a 5/16 inch radius, which I'll put onto the seat, but you can go all the way up to a 1/2 inch radius if you want something really soft. Now to make that radius, I'll run the router along the end of the board. That way I can follow the curvature of the seat scoop. And to help make this a little bit easier so the router does not have a tendency to tip, I can clamp a block of wood onto the backside. That's going to give a bigger surface that's going to support the router and keep it from tipping. So there is my completed front edge. One thing I do is I leave a little bit of material on the ends and then I'll hand kind of feather that back. On this particular seat, I'm just going to be doing a light edge breaking, but if you're going to do like a different size round over, leaving yourself a little bit of material between where your bigger round over starts or stops and then your other round over starts or stops is going to give you a little bit of area there. You can blend them together and make it look seamless. So essentially what I have here is I've taken the round over and tapered it down to almost nothing. That way I can hand break all these edges and it'll look nice and seamless as the edge comes around the corner. So with that little detail out of the way, we are ready for some finish sanding and some finish prep. So who's ready to do some serious sanding? So we can take the chair back apart and sand all the pieces individually. And at this stage, you can also do any edge treatment that you want to do on all the parts. Again, I'm just going to be breaking the edges for more of a crisper type of look, but if you want a softer look and feel to the chair, you can add whatever edge treatment you want to the chair. All the parts are initially sanded for you, so I'll start off with 120 grit and work up to 220 grit. Most of these parts are nice and flat, or they have a nice flat area, which makes sanding them pretty easy, but the curved pieces may present a bit of a challenge. It's going to depend on the sander that you have. Now, chances are the concave sections of all these curves are going to be difficult to sand with a power sander, so you may have to resort to some hand sanding. Luckily, it's not a huge deal. There's not a whole lot of surface area here to hand sand, so just take your time and work through the grits and make sure you give this thing a really nice sanding. The finish prep is one of those really critical areas. If you rush here and you do a poor job of finish prep, no matter how good your finish is, it's not going to look good because the stuff underneath it, the poorly prepped wood, is going to be very, very visible. So make sure you take your time, sand through the grits, don't skip any, don't rush through it. Make sure you're checking for any sanding defects like pigtails or swirlies from your sander, and make sure everything is removed and you have a nice, even, uniform surface before calling it good. And one last little detail you want to just address is going to be the bottom of the legs. You want to put a little bit of a roundover or a chamfer on the bottom there. That's going to prevent any fibers from splitting if this chair is dragged across the floor, which, let's be honest, it's a chair. It's going to get dragged across a floor. So with all the parts finished, sanded, and ready to go, we've reached a little bit of a fork in the road, and you can choose to go in either direction. First direction would be to go ahead and do your glue up now, get this thing glued together, and then do the finish application. The other way to go is to swap things around and do your finish application now while the parts are like this, and then do all your glue up later on. I'm going to go ahead and do a pre-finishing, which means I'll be finishing all the parts individually and then gluing up. It's going to be a lot easier to apply finish to parts individually like this before it's all put together. You don't have to worry about any inside corners. The drips and runs are a lot easier to catch because you have a lot more visibility on all the parts, and it's just generally less stressful and more enjoyable. So I'm going to move forward with that. If you're still on the fence as to what finish you want to do, what your finishing process is going to be, or what exact finish you want to use, one little area you can kind of play with here is going to be the bottom of the seat. So you can have this whole area here to mix and match and compare things side by side. This is never going to be seen since that's, the bottom of a chair. So if you want to do a side-by-side comparison of, if you want to use any kind of stains or pigments or dyes, you can do that side by side here on the bottom of the seat. It gives you a lot of area to work on. So keep that in mind if you're not quite sure as to the finishing process you want to use. You have a nice big sample area built into the kit. So let's get these things prepped. Prepped for pre-finishing, I guess. Pre-finish prepped, I guess. So pre-finishing, it takes a little bit of a different consideration than a normal finishing process. So the first thing you want to consider when you're doing pre-finishing is going to be to protect all your glue surfaces. If you get finish onto your glue surfaces, glue's not going to stick. Your chair's not going to stay together, which, isn't all that good. So the tendons are going to be the easiest thing to protect. I like to do that with just some masking tape. It's really easy just to mask off those tendons and not to worry about them. The mortises, on the other hand, can be a little more tricky, so you can find something to put in here to protect it from finish if you need to. And it's also really going to depend on the type of finish you actually are going to apply. If you're going to be doing a hand applied finish like I'm doing, it's actually really easy to avoid getting finish into these areas. So I personally don't bother actually protecting these because I can just not get finish in there. If you are spraying, for instance, you're definitely going to want to put something in there because spray can literally go everywhere. So you can fill these with some foam or like a cloth or a towel or a rag, anything that gets in there and just blocks finish from touching the surfaces down in there. It's really up to you how far you want to go with it. Now, the other thing you want to think about is work holding, which is something you don't normally think about with actual finishing. So if you're finishing the whole chair assembled, you just plop the chair down on its legs and go to town. When you have all these individual parts that have 4 sides and you finish on them, for instance, you have to find some way to creatively hold these. So what I like to do is actually hang them from the ceiling. It makes it a lot easier to finish all the 4 sides. Gives you really easy access to all 4 sides, and you can just let it go and leave it alone. So you have a few different options there. I'll show you a few of those real quick here in my shop. A spring clamp like this is going to be the most convenient way to hold parts that have things that can actually be held. So the tendons make for really good areas for holding, and the spring clamp makes it really easy to take these things on and off the string. This is just hung on a string hanging from the ceiling. So that's one option if you have some spring clamps and somewhere to actually grab. Now, how about some of these odd parts that don't really have tendons or really convenient places to grab? So for the legs, what I like to do is just run a little eye hook into the top or bottom of the legs, depending on the front or back. So the front leg, you could really hang them upside down or right side up. The top and bottom are not show faces or show surfaces. The rear legs can be a little bit different. The top is obviously a show area, so you have to hang these things upside down. So for these, I just drill a small pilot hole into the end grain and then just screw in the eye hook, and I can hang that from the ceiling. I have mine attached to some spring clamps so I can clamp them to my ceiling joist really quickly, but these eye hooks can also be hung on a string from the ceiling. A slightly different way to hang the goofy things is to use a screw instead of an eye hook if you don't happen to have eye hooks. Eye hooks are just more convenient because they have an actual hole to feed a string through. The screw you have to wrap the string around, but it still works just fine. So another one of the goofy things is going to be the back slats like these guys here. So these can be hung with a screw or an eye hook into the end grain and just hung from the ceiling really easily. Now another great way to hang the parts with the tenons, which is a little less convenient, is to drill a hole through the tenon and then string them up through that hole. So I've just attached some string to my ceiling and I can thread these things onto some string and tie them off. Not nearly as convenient as a spring clamp to get these things on and off, but it is very, very effective. Man, that is quite the sea of parts. If you haven't already caught on, I am doing 2 chairs right now. So I have a red oak one as well as the quarter sawn white oak that I'm finishing here. So speaking of finishing, let's get started on that. So I'm using a wipe-on polyurethane or wipe-on varnish. That's a finish that I really like. It offers a lot of flexibility as far as application goes. It also offers a fair amount of protection in the final product. Now, one of the biggest questions I'm sure people have with finishing is what finish is best for a certain project. And honestly, the best finish to use is the one you can apply the best. There's a lot of different products that will give you very similar results as far as the color or as far as the amount of protection goes, but it really comes down to what you're most comfortable applying. If you're trying to apply something that you're not good at applying, it might not look that good. But if you're able to apply something that you're actually really good at and you understand the nuances of applying that finish, you can end up with a really nicely finished product. So I personally stick to the wipe-on poly since that's just what I know the best. I've applied it for years and I really know the ins and outs of getting that stuff on there and getting the finish and the build that I like. One of the nice things about a wipe-on product like this is it goes on in very small, thin coats, so you can really have a lot of flexibility as to the final desired result as far as the film build. So if you want a very close to the wood look, you could only put on maybe 2, maybe 3 coats. If you want a little more protection, a little more build, you can go 5 or more. So it gives you a lot of flexibility there. The other nice thing about the finish going on so thin and so gradually is that you have a lot of time to do more gradual build. So if you forget a spot, for instance, you miss a spot, that's not a huge deal because it's going to get coated again the next time you come around, and you might not even notice that there's a little less finish in that spot because all of the layers are so thin. So this stuff is fairly easy to apply. This first coat is a flood coat or a seal coat. The wood's really thirsty at this point, so I'll apply it really heavily, allow the wood to soak in as much as it wants to, and just wipe off any excess that might be left on the surface. After that first coat has some time to cure, I'll come back with some 600 grit sandpaper, sand all the parts, clean off all of the sanding dust, and then I can go ahead and apply a second coat. The second coat and the subsequent coats are going to be very similar. They'll go on very lightly. Again, not trying to do a whole lot of build. You don't want a big puddle of finish there on the surface. You want to lightly and gradually build the finish, and applying finish lightly, and especially with the hand applicator, is going to keep the possibility of drips and runs to a minimum. Especially like this, because we're finishing all vertical, the finish is going to have a tendency to run downwards with gravity. Normally with this finish I apply 5 coats, but for these chairs I want a little more closer to the wood type finish, so I'm just going to go to 3 coats. And on the last coat I applied that even lighter than the build coats. Basically all I'm doing with that last coat is evening things out after that last sanding, and it's giving things a nice even sheen. So I am all done applying finish to my parts, and they're looking pretty darn good. So now as I'm taking them down, I'll give them a light sanding with some 1000 grit sandpaper. That's going to clean up any little dust nibs or little bumps or any kind of imperfections on the surface, really smooth things out. The nice thing about hanging them is there's less chance of things settling on them. So there isn't a whole lot of dust nibs on here just by the virtue of the fact that it's vertical. And the other fact that, or for me at least, that last coat of finish goes on pretty thin, so it tends to set up really quickly and doesn't have a whole lot of time where things can actually get stuck in the finish. So while these things are up here still hanging, it's just a really convenient way to just hit them with this sandpaper. I'm not really sanding really roughly or with a lot of force or a lot of aggression. This is just a really, really light sanding, minimal finger pressure just to knock off any rough spots and smooth things out. So now it's time to get into the assembly process, and that assembly is going to be 4 kind of stages, I suppose. So we'll have the back glue up, so the back of the chair glue up, the front of the chair glue up. We'll connect those 2 assemblies together with the connecting assembly, and then we'll do the seat install. So 4 different steps, I guess. So we have our 5 different components here. We have the 2 rear legs, the crest rail, the lower rail, and then the back slat. So the first thing I'm going to do is on the back slat, I've removed the finish from the bottom here. This is the area we're going to glue into the lower rail. You can try and mask this off before you finish it, but most finishes are probably going to seep under it, the masking anyway, and you end up cleaning it off regardless. So, you know, one less thing to worry about. You're going to clean it up anyway. A little bit of scraping, that just comes right off, and it has a nice fresh glue surface. If you're spraying, you might be able to get away with masking that, but I think it's just easier just to scrape off a bit of the finish when it's time to put this thing together. So to get started with the assembly, I'll first put some glue onto the tenons on the 2 rails. Now the back slat's going to connect into the grooves with both glue and a bit of silicone. So on the middle area where we're gluing the bottom, we'll put some wood glue there. The top needs to be able to float up into the top rail, so this thing can flex a little bit as you're sitting in it. So this will be silicone into the top. And also put a few beads of silicone under the bottom corners here. If you look at the bottom of the back slat, it's angled a little bit, so there's a little bit of area here for some pads for a little bit of silicone. Okay, so into the lower rail, let's put just a glob kind of thing on each end. You don't need a whole lot. And then over here in the middle, let's put some wood glue. And you can put glue onto the back slat, or you can put glue down in here, or you can do both. It's up to you. Now on the top rail, we're going to do something similar, just only silicone. So down on each end, just put a glob. Just like that. And now we can put everything together. And just because, I'm also going to throw a little bit of glue down to these mortises, just to make sure I have plenty of glue coverage as these joints come together. Now to clamp this thing, you can use a band clamp. I'm using a ratchet strap here, just for tying down cargo. So I can wrap that around the bottom here, put the hooks in the middle, and then just snug up the strap along the back here. As I'm snugging up, I just want to watch this connection as the tenon goes into the mortise, make sure that the ratchet strap is not trying to roll the legs outwards. So I can adjust as needed. I'm just going to use a little bit of twisting force to make sure it's closing correctly. There we go. And we can use another ratchet strap up here to fully seat the crest rail into its mortise. Again, just want to make sure it's not getting pulled out of alignment. And once everything looks good, we can set this aside and we can put together the front assembly. So now for a slightly easier glue up, we have the front assembly. So I have that front connecting rail here, and we want to make note of which side is the front. Again, it's going to be the pointier side. So this thing has a little bit of an angle like this on the ends, so you want the wider side to be the front. So for the front legs, I have one face that has 2 mortises and one that has 1. The single mortise is going to be the front, and I'll put these to the bottom so I know that's towards the back of the chair. So I'm looking at the front face. Again, over here, I have my mortise. I actually want the ones I don't want down on the table so I don't mess this up. And then this is the front face. So again, the front face of the front rail, that's going to be the wider side. So they're angled in that direction. And we can either do it this way or this way. This is a pretty straight grain piece. So I'm just going to put it in just like this. The only little bit of alignment you have to worry about here is just making sure that the top of the legs are flush with the top of that rail, and then we can clamp it up. Okay, and we can set this aside to dry as well. One thing I'm mentioning, as you can see here, I have some squeeze out. I find it's a lot easier to remove that once the glue has set up a bit, especially since this is already finished and ready to go. If you take a damp rag and try and wipe this up right now, what you'll end up doing is smearing glue all over your finish. So you'll have some cloudy or hazy areas that basically just have glue on top of your finish. Leaving it like this allows it to set up, and it's just going to kind of pop off of the wood anyway. So you won't have anywhere near the amount of mess to really worry about. So I'll let this set up for a bit, and then I'll see you in a little bit, and we'll connect the two assemblies together. So that glue has cured a little bit. I'm going to come in here and just separate it from the base with a chisel. And this should just pop right out of here. There we go. There. Much nicer cleanup. Okay, the glue is dry on the two sub-assemblies, so we can get these out of the clamps and then join them together. So I just did a quick dry fit to make sure I knew which parts go where, since a lot of these aren't really reversible. It only goes together one way. So, one last dry assembly to make sure I know where everything goes, and we can get some glue onto all these joints and get this thing assembled. Okay. Ooh. Now to clamp this, again, we can use the ratchet straps. So I wrap that around this top area here. I'm just going to snug it up a little bit so it doesn't fall down. And before going too crazy with this, just want to put something between here so you don't scratch the wood with the clamp. So a piece of cardboard or a scrap piece of wood or really anything that's going to just protect that area there from the clamp digging in. It shouldn't take a whole lot of pressure to close all these joints. We might have to tweak things a little bit, get everything to seat properly. Now, if you are having issues getting the lower rail here to close all the way, you can use a ratchet strap here as well to pull that together. So you can see I've also added a clamp on here so that the strap can't get pulled upwards. And this is going to allow you to apply pressure directly to this lower rail here, making sure it's fully seated on both ends. Now, a couple quick checks before we leave this thing to dry. First off, just want to make sure it's on a flat surface and it's not rocking. It's going to form to whatever shape it's in right now. So in order to have it sure it doesn't rock, having it glued up in a manner it's not rocking, it's going to set you up for success. The other thing we'll just check here is the inside measurements here to make sure it is square. That's going to make sure the seat actually fits on here as it's supposed to. So I'll just measure the diagonals on both sides here, compare them, and make any adjustments as needed. Okay, so with the glue all set on this thing, we can get these clamps off of here and then work on getting the seat attached. Now, the last thing on the list is going to be to get this seat installed. So in the hardware kit, you're going to have two different corner blocks. You'll have one that's at a 45. Those are going to be for the front of the chair, and you'll have one at a much steeper angle. These are going to be for the rear of the chair. You're also going to have 18 of these 1.25" screws, and you'll have 4 each of a 2.5" and a 2" long screw. So we can set the seat aside for a bit, and we'll get the corner blocks installed into the chair frame. So I'll flip the chair frame upside down on the bench, just like that. And we'll start with the front blocks. So these blocks reinforce the connection here and give us a place to secure the seat down to the frame. So what we really want to do is make sure that we don't mount these things proud of the bottom surface here of the chair frame. If we do, we can't pull that seat down tightly to the rails. So what's more preferable than even going flush with this is to set these things up a little bit. That way there's a little bit of a gap between where the top of the rail is and the top of the block. And we drive the screw in here that goes into the seat. That'll suck that seat down tightly to the rails. So the correct orientation for these, it doesn't really matter kind of which way, there's no left or right. You just need this hole to be facing up, which should be down towards the floor later, so we can get the screw in here, which will go down into the seat. So these guys go in here, something like this. I'll make that offset a little bit. I have a piece of cardboard I'm going to use as a spacer, so I'm going to set that in here and put the block on top of that. That's going to leave a little bit of a gap or a little bit of space, again, to help us suck that seat down to the frame. Into each corner block, we're going to have these 4 1.25" screws. Those are going to go into the holes here on the outsides. So I'll start by installing the screws into the top, since that's a little bit easier from this orientation with my drill. That takes care of one. Let's do the next one. And one thing I want to be careful of as you're installing these things is you don't want to end up tweaking the frame at all so the chair ends up rocking. So be very careful as you're installing these things, as you're tightening them up. Don't really over tighten them. Just get them snugged up and in place. And one thing you can watch for is if the chair starts rocking upside down, like the rails are rocking around, then you probably tweak the frame a little bit. You can back the screws out and readjust things. So now for the rear ones, again, the counterbore hole goes up, and we'll get this thing into the corner. Now it's very likely that the angles here won't match perfectly to your chair, so you can either carefully install them like this with just the toe in, essentially just the outside touching, or you can adjust the angle on here so it actually fits. It's really up to you. Again, you don't want to go too crazy because it's pretty easy to tweak your frame at this point and end up with a chair that you need to fix a rock on. So that takes care of the mounting of the blocks. Next we'll do the final screw installation of the blocks, which is going to be with the longer screws. These are going to go through the hole here in the middle and pin these things into the legs. So again here, just take your time. You don't want to end up tweaking the frame at all and twisting it. Now real quickly, let's just take a look and see how we're doing on keeping this thing from warping. See if we have any rock. Well, still pretty good. And you can see the blocks are just below the surface of the rail here a little bit, which is going to be perfect for pulling that seat down. So let's get this seat installed next. So I'm going to take our seat and flip it upside down. And I'll have the back side here hanging off the end of the workbench. And I'm going to flip the chair down on top of it. So you want to make sure the chair frame is butted fully into the seat, and then we want to get our left and right alignment. But because the back of the seat and the back of the chair have that curve in it, it basically allows you to pivot through here and get the alignment left to right exactly where it needs to be. So you want to get it fully pressed in here and then get these two sides to be the same protrusion past the rails. Now the first screws to go in are going to be the ones in the back here. These are going to be these pocket holes that are going to pull the seat into the back rail. So just make sure that these screws have pulled that seat fully into that back rail. That back curve there is actually going to set the actual alignment left to right, in and out, and everything for the rest of the seat, so that the next 4 screws are actually super easy. With the seat confirmed along that back curve, we can put the screws into the counterbore holes that are facing up right now and screw the seat down into those corner blocks. So that takes care of the full assembly, so I can flip this thing up and take a look at it, see how it looks, and more importantly, see if it rocks. There's a very good possibility of tweaking the frame a little bit at this stage and having it end up rocking, but seem to have gotten that put together just perfectly. Now what if you get your chair assembled and it has a little bit of this going on? Just a little bit of rock. This is probably more than you'd really want to call good enough, but it's fairly easy to fix. The one thing I do want to stress, like as you're working through this whole thing, is if you can make sure this chair does not rock as you're putting it together, you're going to save yourself one less thing to do. But it is possible to still end up with a chair that rocks a little bit, but it's fairly straightforward to fix. All you need is a flat surface and a bit of coarse sandpaper. The first step is going to be to identify the long legs. So in order to do that, figure out where the rock is. So in my case, I'm rocking from this front corner to this rear corner here. Those are the short ones. So that means I need to shorten up the 2 long ones, which are going to be the opposite ones. So this corner here and this corner here. So it's up to you which one you want to address. I'm going to do the rear leg since it's right here. I have some coarse sandpaper here. You can stick it down to your flat surface. You can use some 2-sided tape, carpet tape, spray adhesive. In my case, I'm using some packing tape just to get that piece of sandpaper just stuck there so it's not going to move as I'm adjusting this leg. Now it's just a matter of taking the leg and rubbing it back and forth on the sandpaper until you move enough material to make this thing not rock anymore. So after a few strokes on the sandpaper, this thing is now sitting like rock solid. It's not rocking anymore. So fairly simple to fix. It's just one of those things that if you can prevent having to do this, you'll have one less thing to do. So that takes care of the assembly of a chair kit in style 5. The only thing left to do at this point is to find some butts to put in these seats. So I hope you enjoy the assembly process of your chair kit, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions along the way. So thank you for watching, and happy woodworking.